The iron rang out sharp and clear as Luke Carter brought his hammer down, orange sparks dancing in the dim light of his smithy. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the cool morning air drifting through the open doors. 10 years of honest work had built him a reputation in Pueblo as the finest blacksmith between Santa Fe and Wichita, though few knew the calluses on his hands once came from gripping pistols rather than tools. The rhythmic pounding paused as his daughter Eleanor's voice carried across the dusty street. At 8 years old, she was the spitting image of her mother Caroline. Same golden hair and bright eyes that had captured Luke's heart when he'd first stumbled into town, bleeding and desperate to leave his old life behind. He watched through the doorway as Eleanor chased a hoop down the packed dirt road, her laughter echoing off the adobe walls. Caroline appeared in the smithy entrance, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Nathan Lopez is asking after those wagon wheel repairs again," she said, stepping carefully around the scattered tools and half-finished projects. "Says he needs to make a supply run to Durango by week's end." Luke nodded, already reaching for the partially mended wheel propped against the wall. The desert was unforgiving on wagon wheels, and Nathan's regular business helped keep food on their table. The familiar routine of work and family had almost let Luke forget the man he used to be. The infamous Ghost Carter, who'd led the most successful gang of bank robbers in the territory. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried, like the cache of gold they'd hidden in an abandoned mine shaft after their last job. He'd walked away from that life and that fortune, finding something far more precious in this quiet town. A commotion from the street drew Luke's attention. 3 riders were approaching from the east, heat waves distorting their shapes as they emerged from the shimming horizon. Something about their silhouettes sent a chill down his spine despite the forge's warmth. The way they sat their horses, the deliberate pace. He recognized it even after all these years. These were men who lived by the gun, and they were coming straight for his shop. The lead rider pulled up outside, dust settling around his horse's hooves. Luke's heart nearly stopped as he recognized Isaac Hall, his former second-in-command. The years hadn't been kind to Isaac. His face was harder, deeper lines etched by sun and violence. The other 2 were strangers, but Luke could read their type easily enough. Killers for hire, the kind that populated every gang in the territory. "Well, if it ain't the ghost himself," Isaac drawled, swinging down from his saddle. Imagine my surprise when I heard tell of a smithy in Pueblo who could work miracles with iron. Figured there couldn't be 2 men with hands steady enough for both triggering and tinkering. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he stepped into the shadows of the shop. "Been a long time, brother." Caroline had gone still as a statue, her face draining of color as she registered the tension crackling between the men. Luke shifted slightly, putting himself between his wife and the newcomers. "That life's behind me, Isaac. I ain't your brother anymore." His voice was quiet but firm, though his mind was racing. How many more of the old gang were out there? Had they already found the gold? Isaac's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "That's where you're wrong, Luke. You don't just walk away from family, or from promises made." He moved closer, boots scraping on the packed earth floor. "We've got unfinished business to discuss, about a certain deposit we made, back in '73. His hand rested casually near his holster, a gesture Luke remembered all too well. The sound of Eleanor's hoop rolling past the door made Luke's blood run cold. Everything he'd built, everything he loved, balanced on a knife's edge. He could see the threat in Isaac's eyes. The past had finally caught up, and it was demanding its due. The hammer felt heavy in his hand as he wondered if he could swing it faster than Isaac could draw. The man he'd become warred with the man he used to be, while his family's lives hung in the balance. Caroline must have sensed his internal struggle. She moved forward, head held high despite her fear. "Mr. Hall, my husband is in the middle of urgent repairs. Perhaps you gentlemen could return later?" Her voice was steady, but Luke could hear the slight tremor beneath her words. Isaac's eyes flickered to her, then back to Luke, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Oh, we ain't going nowhere, ma'am. Your man and I got a lot of catching up to do." Isaac settled himself on a wooden barrel, making it clear he intended to stay. "Matter of fact, I reckon the whole town's going to want to hear the tales I could tell about their trusted smithy." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke after a firefight. Luke's mind raced through options, each worse than the last. He could feel the weight of his old Colt, hidden beneath the floorboards under his anvil. 10 years of peace threatened to unravel in an instant. But he wasn't that man anymore. Or was he? As Eleanor's laughter drifted in again from outside, he realized some choices were already made for him. He'd die before he let his past destroy his family's future. Luke wiped the sweat from his brow with a soot-stained sleeve, his calloused hands steady despite the turmoil churning inside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the smithy's open doors, painting stark lines across Isaac's weathered face. Behind him, Caroline had quietly shepherded Eleanor away, her quick thinking giving Luke one less immediate worry. But he knew this moment of relative calm was as fragile as spring ice. "You always did know how to make an entrance, Isaac," Luke said, carefully setting down his hammer. The metal's ring still echoed in his ears, a familiar rhythm now interrupted by the ghosts of his past. He could see Caleb and Joshua, shifting restlessly outside, their shapes dark against the desert's harsh glare. Three of his old gang, which meant Nathan wasn't far. Nathan, who'd always been the worst of them all. The dry wind whistled through the gaps in the smithy's wooden walls, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. Luke moved deliberately, positioning himself between Isaac and his tools, both the honest ones of his trade and the deadly one concealed beneath. 10 years is a long time to hold on to old business, he said, watching Isaac's fingers drum against his gun belt. Isaac's laugh was as dry as the desert itself. "Ain't about holding on, brother. It's about collecting what's owed. That cash we buried outside Durango? Time's come to dig it up." He leaned forward, boots scraping against the packed earth floor. "Unless you already helped yourself to it, seeing as how comfortable you've made yourself herein." He glanced around with exaggerated disdain, whatever this peaceful little slice of heaven is called. The mention of Durango sent Luke's mind spinning back to that last job, the one that had changed everything. The bank robbery had gone wrong, so wrong, and in the chaos they'd buried the stolen gold in the dead of night. He'd left before sunrise, carrying nothing but guilt and a desperate need to become someone else. Someone better. Through the window, Luke caught glimpses of townspeople going about their business, unaware of the powder keg building in the smithy. Old Mr. Peterson, leading his horse to water, Rose sweeping the boardwalk in front of her store, Charlotte's children playing marbles in the dust. These were his people now, his responsibility. He'd built something real here, something honest. That money's cursed, Isaac. 3 people died for it. Let it stay buried. Luke's voice was quiet but firm, though he knew reasoning with Isaac was like trying to stop a sandstorm with bare hands. The other man's eyes had taken on that familiar, dangerous gleam, the one that had always preceded violence in their outlaw days. Isaac stood slowly, his spurs jingling with deliberate menace. "Here's how this plays out, Luke. You're gonna draw us a map, nice and detailed like. Then maybe, we ride out without sharing some mighty interesting stories with your fine neighbors." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "Or we can do this the hard way. Your choice, but I'd think careful about that pretty wife and daughter of yours." The mention of his family sent a cold wave through Luke's chest, despite the desert heat. He'd known this day might come, had prepared for it in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't find him. Behind his anvil, beneath those loose floorboards, lay not just his old Colt but also a carefully drawn map, insurance against exactly this scenario. But handing it over meant unleashing Isaac and the others on Durango, and he knew too well what kind of destruction would follow. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Luke could hear Caleb's horse stamping impatiently, could feel the weight of Joshua's stare through the window. Time was running out, and with it, his options for keeping his two worlds from colliding. The man he'd been and the man he'd become were about to meet in a reckoning long overdue. Luke's fingers traced the worn leather of his smithing apron, mind racing through possibilities. He'd built something real here in Durango, not just the smithy, but a life worth protecting. The last 15 years had given him a chance to become the man his father always hoped he'd be, before that fateful day in Tucson when he'd first fallen in with Isaac's crew. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd found redemption working with the same fire and metal that had once forged the tools of his crimes. "You've got until sundown tomorrow," Caleb continued, adjusting his duster as he backed toward the door. "Isaac's waiting in the hills north of town. You know how he gets when he's kept waiting." The younger man's voice carried a note of sympathy that made Luke's jaw clench. Of all his former riding companions, Caleb had been the only one who'd ever shown a glimmer of conscience. Through the window, Luke watched Joshua mount up behind Caleb, the two riders disappearing into the gathering dusk. His shoulders sagged as he moved to close up the smithy. Each familiar task now waited with fresh significance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Durango's dusty main street as Luke Carter worked the forge behind his blacksmith shop, each strike of his hammer sending sparks dancing through the dim interior. The rhythmic pounding helped quiet his mind, though he couldn't fully silence the echoes of his past that had grown louder since receiving that morning's telegram, warning him that his old gang was heading south from Pueblo. Caroline Nelson watched her husband from the doorway of their modest home next door, concern etching lines around her eyes. After 5 years of marriage, she knew when something troubled Luke, even if he tried to hide it behind his steadfast focus on his work. The way his shoulders tensed with each blow of the hammer told her more than words could. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Luke's hammer freeze mid-strike. 3 riders appeared through the heat waves rippling off the hard-packed earth, their horses' flanks dark with sweat from the punishing desert sun. Luke recognized Nathan Hall's cocksure posture even before he could make out his former friend's face beneath the wide brim of his hat. "Well, if it ain't the reformed man himself," Nathan called out as he dismounted, spurs jingling. His companions, Joshua Lopez and Isaac Allen, spread out slightly behind him, hands hovering near their holsters. "Time's been good to you, Luke. Got yourself a nice little setup here. Real respectable-like." The words dripped with mockery. Luke set down his hammer with deliberate care, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "What brings you boys to Durango?" he asked, though he already knew. The gang's last heist before he'd left them, $50,000 in gold taken from a Union Pacific train, was buried in the desert. Luke was the only one who knew exactly where. "Don't play coy, old friend," Nathan said, stepping closer. 5 years is a mighty long time to sit on that kind of secret. Caleb Carter's been real patient, waiting for his little brother to come to his senses. But patience ain't exactly my strong suit no more. His hand rested openly on his gun now. Caroline had emerged onto their small porch, rifle in hand. Luke's heart clenched at the sight of her facing down these dangerous men, but pride mixed with his fear. She'd known some of his past when they'd married, accepted that he was trying to build a different life. Now that past was threatening everything they'd created together. "Your brother sends his regards," Nathan continued, ignoring Caroline's presence. "He's up in Wichita, gathering some old friends. Figures you might need some convincing to remember where that gold's buried. Thought I'd ride ahead, give you time to think it over proper-like before he arrives." Luke's mind raced through possibilities. He could give them the location, but he knew these men. They'd kill him and Caroline anyway, leave no witnesses. Running wasn't an option. They'd hunt them down. Fighting meant putting the whole town at risk. He needed time to figure out a way to protect his family and keep the peace he'd found. 3 days, Nathan announced, mounting up. "That's how long you've got till Caleb gets here. Best spend it remembering exactly where you buried our gold, Luke. Hate to see anything happen to this nice little life you've built." The threat in his voice was clear as a rattler's warning. After the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, Caroline rushed to Luke's side. "We need to tell Sheriff Eleanor Hall," she insisted. Luke shook his head. Eleanor was Nathan's sister, and though she wore a badge now, blood ties ran deep. He couldn't be sure where her loyalties would fall. That night, as Luke held Caroline close in their bed, his mind wandered to the cedar box hidden beneath the floorboards of his shop. Inside lay a map he'd sworn never to look at again, marking the gold's location in the twisting canyons north of Tucson. He'd buried more than money out there. He'd buried the man he used to be. The next morning brought Josephine Lopez to their door, the schoolteacher's usual cheerful demeanor replaced with worried tension. "Nathan and his men were asking questions at the saloon last night," she reported. "About you, about the town's defenses. People are scared, Luke. They remember the last time outlaws came through." Luke worked through the day in a fog of memories and fears, his hammer striking with less certainty than usual. Young Charlotte Allen, daughter of the general store owner, brought him lunch as she often did, but today her innocent chatter about town gossip felt like it came from another world entirely. As sunset approached, Luke made his decision. He couldn't let his past destroy this town, these good people who'd accepted him without question. That night, after Caroline had fallen into troubled sleep, He retrieved the map and saddled his horse. He'd ride out to meet Caleb on his own terms, try to end this before it could escalate into the bloodbath he feared was coming. But as he led his horse quietly down the alley behind his shop, a familiar voice stopped him. "Going somewhere, little brother?" Caleb Carter emerged from the shadows, flanked by two men Luke didn't recognize. His older brother's face was harder than he remembered, weathered by years and bitterness. "Thought you might try something noble like this. Always were the soft one." Luke's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, where he'd once kept his gun, but found only empty air. Caleb noticed the gesture and laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the adobe walls. "Still got those old reflexes, I see, but you're not that man anymore, are you?" All settled down, playing at being respectable. The moonlight caught the silver in Caleb's hair, reminding Luke how much time had passed since they'd last faced each other. "The money's gone, Caleb," Luke lied, hoping to end this quickly. "I used it to start over. There's nothing left to find." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, and he knew his brother wouldn't believe them. The desert wind kicked up dust around their boots, carrying with it the scent of sage and coming rain. Caleb's companions shifted restlessly, their hands never far from their weapons. The taller one, with a badly healed broken nose, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Boss, we ain't got time for family reunions. Either he tells us where it is, or we start making things interesting for these fine townsfolk." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Luke felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Behind him, his shop stood dark and silent, the forge cold for the first time in years. Caroline slept there, trusting and unaware, while somewhere in town, young Charlotte Allen dreamed innocent dreams, and Eleanor tended her sick daughter Rose at the boarding house. "You've got until sunrise," Caleb said, his voice carrying the weight of years of resentment. "Meet us at the old mission ruins outside town. Bring the map, or I start visiting your friends. Maybe I'll start with that pretty wife of yours." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Luke? Don't try warning the sheriff. Joshua's been bought and paid for since before you even arrived in town." As his brother melted back into the shadows with his men, Luke stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. The betrayal of Sheriff Joshua stung, but it explained the man's recent strange behavior and pointed questions about Luke's past. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he desperately hoped never to see again. Inside the shop, Luke found Caroline awake, sitting at their small kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee. "I heard voices," she said quietly, her eyes searching his face in the lamplight. "It's time, isn't it? The past you never talk about has finally caught up with us." Her voice held no accusation, only a deep sadness that cut Luke to his core. Luke sat heavily in the chair across from her, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a physical force. "I need to tell you everything," he said. "But first you need to pack. You'll stay with Eleanor at the boarding house. She's an old friend from Durango. She'll understand." The words tumbled out as he formulated a plan. Caroline reached across the table and took his calloused hand in hers. "I'm not going anywhere until I know the truth. All of it." Her grip tightened. "We promised no secrets when we married, Luke. It's time you kept that promise." As the night deepened, Luke told her everything about the gang, the failed bank robbery in Tucson that left 2 men dead, the hidden fortune that had haunted him for 5 years. He spoke of Caleb's descent into violence, of his own desperate escape to Pueblo, and finally, of the map that led to a cave in the red rocks where they'd buried the money. When he finished, Caroline sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, a coyote's lonely call echoed across the desert. Finally, she stood and began gathering supplies. "If we're going to save this town," she said with quiet determination, "we'll need help. Nathan at the livery stable. He was a Texas Ranger before settling here. And Isaac, the old buffalo hunter who lives on the edge of town. He owes you for fixing his rifle last winter." Luke stared at his wife in amazement, seeing her in a new light. She wasn't running, wasn't condemning him. Instead, she was planning, fighting. "It's not your battle," he protested weakly, but she cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "The moment I married you, your battles became mine," she said, checking the priming on an old revolver she'd pulled from a trunk. "Now, are you going to sit there all night, or are we going to save our home?" The desert sun hung like molten brass in the cloudless sky as Luke Carter watched his former gang ride into Pueblo from the shadows of his smithy. Their horses kicked up clouds of ochre dust, marking their approach like a serpent's trail across the parched earth. 5 riders, led by his one-time friend Nathan Hall, now his most dangerous enemy. Luke's hammer fell silent on the anvil as his past finally caught up with him. Caroline, his wife of 3 years, noticed his tension from the doorway of their modest home beside the smithy. She knew that look, the one that spoke of dark memories he'd shared on long nights when guilt wouldn't let him sleep. Their eyes met briefly before she hurried inside to hide their young son, Isaac. Luke had always feared this day would come, when the blood money he'd helped steal would draw his old life back like vultures to carrion. The gang spread out through Pueblo's main street, their intentions clear as they began questioning townspeople. Joshua Nelson, the youngest of the bunch, had grown from the teenager Luke remembered into a hardened killer. Caleb Allen rode beside him, his distinctive scarred face drawing fearful glances from the townsfolk who scattered before their approach. Luke counted the minutes, knowing it wouldn't take long before someone pointed them toward the smithy. The years of peace had changed Luke in ways his former companions couldn't understand. The man who'd once killed without hesitation now spent his days crafting plowshares and horseshoes, finding redemption in honest work and the love of his family. But as he watched Nathan dismount outside the saloon, Luke knew peaceful resolution wasn't possible. The gang wouldn't leave without the money, and he couldn't let them tear apart the town searching for it. Eleanor Lopez, the widow who ran the general store, caught Luke's eye as she hurried past. She'd been good to his family when they first arrived, never asking questions about his past. Now she gave him a subtle nod, indicating she would help spread word to get people off the streets. Luke had earned the town's trust over the years, and they would stand behind him. But he couldn't let innocent people die for his sins. The gang's arrival had stirred up more than just Luke's demons. Rose Nelson, Joshua's sister who'd settled in Pueblo years before, emerged from her dressmaker's shop with fire in her eyes. She'd never forgiven her brother for choosing the outlaw life after their parents' death. Luke saw the familiar weight of a hidden gun beneath her skirts as she watched Joshua with a mix of love and fury that mirrored his own conflicted heart. Nathan's voice carried across the street as he questioned Josephine Carter, Luke's sister-in-law who worked at the saloon. Luke tensed, but Josephine played her part perfectly, feigning ignorance about the smithy's owner. She'd helped him bury his past when he first arrived, understanding his desire for redemption. Now she was buying him precious time to decide how to handle this confrontation. Charlotte Hall, Nathan's wife who'd once been like a sister to Luke, sat her horse apart from the others. Her presence surprised him. She'd always opposed Nathan's violent tendencies. Reading the silent plea in her eyes, Luke realized she hadn't come for the money. She wanted to prevent bloodshed, trying to honor the friendship they'd once shared. But Nathan's obsession with the lost fortune had poisoned him beyond reason. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Luke made his decision. He couldn't run. Not again. The money was hidden in the old mission ruins outside town, but revealing its location wouldn't satisfy Nathan's thirst for vengeance. His former friend wanted more than gold. He wanted to destroy the peace Luke had found, to prove that a man couldn't change his nature. The time had come to show Nathan how wrong he was. Luke moved purposefully through his smithy, gathering the tools of his former trade, weapons he'd sworn never to touch again. The weight of his gun belt felt foreign after so long, but his hands remembered. He checked his revolvers with practiced efficiency, then strapped on the knife he'd kept hidden all these years. The steel sang against the leather as he drew it, testing the edge he'd maintained despite his vows. The sun was setting when Nathan finally entered the smithy, alone as Luke had expected. Their eyes met across the workspace that had been Luke's sanctuary, now defiled by the shadow of violence. "You've gone soft," Nathan sneered, taking in the domestic scene, "playing at honest work while we struggled with your betrayal." His hand hovered near his gun, but Luke knew he wouldn't draw first. Nathan always did enjoy toying with his prey. "The money was never yours to begin with," Luke replied, his voice steady despite the thunder of his heart. "We stole it from people who'd earned it honest. I'm not giving you the location, Nathan. Not now, not ever." He saw the decision form in Nathan's eyes, a heartbeat, before the gun cleared leather. Luke's own draw was pure reflex, muscle memory unchanged by years of peace. 2 shots split the air like thunder. The impact drove Luke back against his anvil as Nathan's bullet found its mark in his shoulder. But his own shot had been true, striking Nathan's gun hand. The weapon clattered to the floor as Nathan howled in pain and rage. Outside, the sound of gunfire erupted as the rest of the gang engaged with townspeople who'd been quietly gathering. Luke knew Caroline would have organized them, just as they'd planned for such a day. Joshua and Caleb tried to fight their way to the smithy, but Rose's first shot took her brother in the leg. The town's defenders had positioned themselves well, using the element of surprise to their advantage. Charlotte spurred her horse through the chaos, screaming for Nathan to end this madness. But the man Luke had once called friend was beyond reason, lunging for his fallen gun with his good hand. Luke's second shot took Nathan in the chest, a killing blow he'd hoped to avoid. As his former friend fell, Luke saw not the hardened killer he'd become, but the young man who'd once saved his life in a Tucson saloon. "I did change," Luke said softly, watching the light fade from Nathan's eyes. "That's what you never understood. A man can choose to be better than his past." The fighting outside died down as quickly as it had begun. Joshua surrendered at his sister's gunpoint, while Caleb fled into the desert night. Charlotte knelt beside her husband's body, her grief tempered by resignation. She'd known it would end this way. Nathan's obsession had left no other path. Luke stumbled outside, wounded but alive, to find Caroline waiting with their son. The town had stood with them, proving that trust and redemption were more powerful than old debts and bitter vengeance. As dawn broke over Pueblo the next day, Luke Carter stood before the mission ruins with his family and the town's leaders. He revealed the hidden cache of money, not for Nathan's memory, but for the good it could finally do. The town would use it to build a school, turning blood money into hope for the future. His past was truly buried now, not in gold or secrets, but in the strength of the community that had helped him become a better man. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pueblo's dusty streets as Luke supervised the removal of the hidden cache from beneath the mission's crumbling adobe walls. His hands, calloused from years at the forge, traced the weathered stones one final time. Each coin and banknote they uncovered seemed to whisper of blood spilled and lives destroyed. But Luke felt only a distant hollow ache where guilt once festered. The town council had gathered to witness the recovery, their faces solemn with the weight of history being unearthed. Caroline stood beside Eleanor, both women watching as Joshua was led away in chains by the territorial marshal. The former gang member had traded his freedom for testimony against Caleb, who remained at large somewhere in the vast desert expanse. Luke caught his wife's eye across the courtyard, seeing in her steady gaze the same strength that had helped him build a new life from the ashes of his past. Their son played near the mission's bell tower, innocent of the violence that had nearly torn their family apart. As workers cataloged the recovered money, Rose approached Luke with a carefully folded document. Plans for the new schoolhouse. The building would rise where Nathan had fallen, transforming a place of death into one of learning and hope. Luke studied the architectural drawings, remembering how his own lack of education had once led him down darker paths. Now his son would have opportunities he never knew. Proof that change was possible not just for one man, but for an entire community. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and creosote as Luke worked late into the evening, forging new hinges for the school's doors. Each strike of his hammer rang with purpose, drowning out the echoes of gunfire that still haunted his dreams. Through the shop's open door, he could see Charlotte preparing to leave town, her husband's body bound for burial in Durango. She had refused her share of the recovered money, asking only that some be used to help other widows and orphans of violence. Word reached Pueblo a week later that Caleb had been spotted near Tucson, gathering men for some new scheme. But the news no longer carried the weight of obligation it once might have. Luke's ledger with the past was settled, his debts paid in full. The town had chosen to stand with him, and he would honor that trust by remaining the man they believed in, not the outlaw he'd once been. As summer faded into autumn, the schoolhouse walls rose steady and true. Luke fashioned decorative metalwork for its gates, weaving symbols of growth and renewal into the design. Caroline had taken on the role of teacher, her natural wisdom finding new purpose in shaping young minds. Their son would start classes when the building opened, joining other children whose parents had once viewed Luke with suspicion, but now called him friend and neighbor. Josephine visited occasionally from Wichita, bringing news of the changing territories and marveling at her brother's transformation. She had kept Joshua's final words to herself, his bitter recognition that Luke had found something worth more than gold: redemption. The former outlaw's path from darkness to light would serve as inspiration for others seeking to change their stars. The day the school bell first rang out across Pueblo's rooftops, Luke stood in his workshop doorway, watching students file into the building that had risen from violence and greed to become a monument to hope. The iron bell had been his finest work, its clear tone carrying far across the desert. Each morning it would remind the town that the future was not bound by the chains of the past, that every soul could forge a new destiny with enough courage and faith. In time, the story of Luke Carter and the gang's hidden fortune became part of local legend, told not as a tale of outlaws and revenge, but as proof that a community's strength lay in its ability to help even the most troubled souls find their way home. The desert winds still carried whispers of violence and greed, but in Pueblo, they found no purchase. The town had learned that true wealth lay not in buried gold, but in the bonds of trust forged in fire and tested by time. The sun hung low over Durango as Luke Carter stepped out of his smithy, wiping soot from his weathered hands. Through the settling dust, he spotted Nathan Allen's gang riding hard toward town. 5 riders, weapons glinting in the fading light. His past had finally caught up with him. Inside the house behind the smithy, his wife Eleanor and young daughter Rose remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. 10 years of peace were about to shatter like glass. The gang reined up outside the saloon, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds that drifted across the rutted street. Luke's fingers twitched, muscle memory from a life he'd tried to bury. He'd sworn off violence the day he left them, trading his gun for a hammer. But now the weight of that old Colt in the rafters called to him like a siren's song. Nathan dismounted first, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. Behind him, Joshua Lopez and Caleb Hall flanked the newcomers. 2 young guns Luke didn't recognize. They'd replaced him, just as he'd replaced his own violent nature with honest work. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried, like a stubborn weed always pushing back through the soil. "Luke Carter," Nathan called out, voice carrying across the quiet street. "Or should I say Lucas the Snake? Heard you turned respectable, old friend. Married the banker's daughter, got yourself a little girl. Real touching." His hand rested casually on his holstered revolver. "But we got unfinished business about that last job. About where you stashed our share before riding off." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, confusion etched on her face as she took in the armed men. Luke's heart clenched. He'd never told her about his past, about the blood on his hands or the stolen fortune he'd hidden away. He'd wanted to protect her from that darkness. Now it stood in the street, threatening everything he held dear. "Nathan, this isn't the way," Luke said, stepping forward. "That money's gone. Gave it to families we hurt, tried to make things right. There's nothing left to find." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. The truth was, he'd buried the gold in the old mission ruins outside Pueblo, planning to retrieve it someday. But a decade of honest living had changed him more than he'd expected. Joshua spat in the dust. "Lying snake. Always were good at that, weren't you? Playing both sides? Pretending to be loyal while plotting to steal it all?" He drew his gun with practiced speed. "Nathan says we do this quiet-like, but I say we burn it all down. Make an example." Eleanor's gasp cut through the tension. "Luke? What are they talking about?" Her voice trembled with dawning understanding. Behind her, Rose peered around the doorframe, eyes wide with fear. Luke's carefully constructed life was crumbling like sand through his fingers. "Get inside," he told them, never taking his eyes off Nathan. "Bar the door. Whatever you hear, don't come out." Eleanor hesitated, then pulled Rose back into the house. The sound of the heavy bar dropping into place echoed in the growing darkness. "You've got 1 hour," Nathan announced. "Take us to the gold or we start killing folks. Maybe that pretty wife of yours first." His cold smile widened. "Or maybe we start with the girl. Your choice, old friend." Luke's mind raced. The mission ruins were a half-day's ride. Even if he led them there, they'd never let his family live. There were too many secrets, too much bad blood. He needed a plan, needed help. Then he remembered Isaac Nelson, the town marshal. They'd fought together in the war before Luke's outlaw days. Maybe there was still enough trust there to count on. "I'll take you," Luke said, buying time. "But I need to get supplies from the store first. Gold's buried deep. Need tools to dig it up." Nathan nodded, gesturing for Joshua to accompany him. As they walked toward the general store, Luke's fingers brushed the hidden derringer in his sleeve. a holdover from his former life he'd never quite been able to abandon. Inside the store, Caroline Nelson looked up from her ledger. Luke caught her eye, tapped his finger twice on the counter, their old signal from the war when her husband Isaac had commanded their unit. Her expression never changed, but he saw understanding flash in her eyes. Help would come, if he could stall long enough. The next few hours unfolded like a deadly chess game. Luke led the gang on a twisting route through the desert, buying time with stories about Apache patrols and hidden trails. Behind them, he knew Isaac and a posse would be following their tracks. The question was whether help would arrive before Nathan's patience ran out. As the moon rose over the desert, Luke finally led them to a narrow canyon. "Gold's buried under that rock formation," he lied, pointing to a cluster of boulders. "Need to move some stones to get to it." Nathan ordered the younger outlaws to start digging, keeping his gun trained on Luke. The ambush, when it came, was swift and deadly. Isaac's posse had circled around while Luke kept the gang distracted. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the canyon, echoing off the rock walls. Joshua went down first, then Caleb, their bodies crumpling in the sand. Luke seized his moment, drawing the Derringer and putting a bullet through Nathan's shoulder. As his former friend fell, Luke grabbed his dropped revolver. The remaining gang members surrendered, faced with overwhelming odds and their leader's defeat. Dawn found Luke riding back into Durango, Nathan and the survivors bound and loaded in a wagon. Isaac rode beside him, their old brotherhood renewed by shared danger. But the hardest test still lay ahead, facing Eleanor and Rose, explaining the truth about his past. They were waiting on the porch when he arrived, Eleanor's face a mask of worry and uncertainty. Luke dismounted slowly, feeling the weight of every sin and secret he'd carried. "I'm sorry," he began, voice rough with emotion. "I should have told you everything long ago. Let me start at the beginning." As the sun climbed higher, Luke shared his full story. The war, the gang, his attempts at redemption. He told them about the gold, still buried near Pueblo, and his plan to use it to help those they'd wronged. Eleanor listened in silence, tears tracking down her cheeks, while Rose held tight to her mother's hand. "I understand if you want to leave," Luke finished, heart heavy with the possibility of losing them. But Eleanor stood, crossed the distance between them, and took his hands in hers. "We're family," she said simply. "Whatever you were before, you're my husband now, Rose's father. That's what matters." In the end, Luke and Isaac rode to Pueblo together, retrieved the gold, and distributed it among the families their gang had terrorized. Nathan and his men faced justice in Tucson. Their reign of violence finally ended. And in Durango, a reformed outlaw continued shaping metal in his forge, grateful for the second chance he'd been given, and the family who chose to stand by him despite his past. The sound of his hammer striking iron still rang out each day, but now it carried a different meaning. Not just honest work, but redemption. Luke Carter had finally found his peace, not by burying his past, but by facing it head-on and choosing a better path forward. In the end, that choice made all the difference. Years passed, and Durango grew alongside Luke's reputation as both a skilled blacksmith and a man of integrity. The townspeople who had once whispered about his past now brought their children to his shop, where he taught them about metalwork and the value of honest labor. Rose, now 12, worked beside her father in the forge, her small hands already showing the same natural talent for shaping iron that had made Luke renowned throughout the territory. Eleanor had expanded their home, adding rooms for travelers and turning it into a respectable boarding house. The sound of guests chatting over breakfast mixed with the rhythmic striking of Luke's hammer, creating a symphony of their hard-earned, peaceful life. Even Isaac, who'd settled in Pueblo after helping Luke make amends, visited regularly with his wife Charlotte, their presence a reminder of how redemption could bridge the deepest divides. The gold they'd returned had done more than ease Luke's conscience. It had transformed lives. In Tucson, families who'd lost everything to Nathan's gang had rebuilt their farms and businesses. Luke received letters occasionally, not of forgiveness exactly, but of understanding. Each one found its place in a wooden box beneath his workbench, tangible proof that the past could be faced without being erased. One autumn morning, as Luke worked on a particularly intricate set of decorative gates for the new church, a rider appeared through the heat waves rising off the desert. It was Joshua, one of Nathan's former gang members who'd served his time and, like Luke, sought a different path. His arrival stirred memories but brought no threat. Only news that Nathan had died in prison, taking his bitterness to the grave. That evening, Luke sat with Eleanor on their porch, watching Rose chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Strange, he mused. How Nathan's death feels like the final page of a book I stopped reading long ago. Eleanor squeezed his hand, understanding in her silence. The past would always be there, but it no longer cast shadows over their future. The next day, Luke began teaching Joshua the blacksmith trade, just as he'd once been taught by the old smith in Wichita, who'd given him his first chance at an honest life. The forge rang with doubled hammers now, and Luke found satisfaction in passing on not just his skills, but the possibility of redemption that had saved him. Spring brought Caroline back to Durango, her medical practice in Pueblo thriving, but her heart still tied to the community that had embraced her during those turbulent days. She found the town changed. New buildings, new faces, but the core of it remained. Good people building lives together, each with their own stories of loss and hope, failure and triumph. Luke's nightmares grew less frequent, though they never completely disappeared. On restless nights, he'd walk to his forge and work quietly, the familiar motions of shaping metal grounding him in the present. Sometimes Rose would join him, her presence reminding him that the best parts of life often grew from the hardest choices. The desert around Durango bloomed that year with unprecedented vigor, carpeting the harsh landscape in wildflowers. To Luke, it seemed a fitting metaphor for his own transformation, beauty and life emerging from seemingly barren ground. He and Eleanor planted a garden, something he'd never imagined doing in his outlaw days, and found joy in coaxing green things from the unforgiving earth. As summer approached, Luke completed his masterwork, an intricate iron tree for the town square, its branches bearing the names of Durango's founding families. Among them, without fanfare or distinction, was Carter, no longer a name that sparked fear, but one that represented craft, community, and the possibility of change. The tree stood as both art and testament, its shadows offering shelter from the desert sun to all who passed beneath. In the end, Luke's story became part of Durango's fabric, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that a man's character wasn't set by his past actions, but by his present choices. The forge still rang with purpose each day, and if its sound carried echoes of old regrets, it also rang with the clear notes of redemption, family, and the quiet pride of a life well lived.